Locals realized something was off when dense plumes of gray smoke started billowing out of a backyard on Wimbledon Park Road. The odor hung thick in the air, absolutely nauseating to anyone nearby. This definitely wasn't your typical weekend cookout. Folks slammed their windows shut, yet that awful reek refused to clear out. Eventually, a worried neighbor picked up the phone and dialed the fire department. First responders hit a locked gate. Upon arrival, spotting a guy pacing near a large fire pit behind the residence, he claimed he was just getting rid of some old trash and food scraps. Those flames were roaring high, sending pitch black smoke into the sky. While the team battled the blaze, they started inspecting the strange contents smoldering within that glowing heap of charred waste. Mixed in with the burnt timber and scrap metal, they noticed distinct outlines that just didn't fit. They made out human bones, a hand, and what looked like facial features. It hit them immediately. They were staring at a human body. Law enforcement swarmed the scene in no time flat. That guy in the yard turned out to be Wissam Madouni, a French citizen residing there with his girlfriend and her 2 kids. Initially, he tried to convince them the charred mass was just the carcass of a sheep. His story didn't add up at all, so officers handcuffed him and started combing through the premises. Once inside, everything looked like a totally typical family home. There were kids' toys scattered around, clothing, and regular household stuff. Back out in the fire pit, investigators sifted through ash to find jewelry and broken eyeglass lenses. They also collected various small trinkets that would eventually prove crucial for identifying the victim. Shortly after, the body was transported to the morgue so a medical examiner could start the grueling task of piecing the remains back together. Although the fire had destroyed so much, just enough evidence remained for detectives to figure out the truth. The deceased was a petite young woman, appearing to be in her early 20s. Her body had been incinerated almost beyond recognition, but she still had an identity, one that her family back in France cherished deeply. This was Sophie Lionnet, a 21-year-old nanny hailing from the city of Troyes. Detectives faced a massive, albeit straightforward mystery. Who exactly was this girl? How did she wind up at this specific residence in London? And what went so wrong that a childcare job spiraled into a nightmare ending in a backyard fire? You think you can handle the grimmest tales coming out of the UK? We're launching our latest release, Unreal True Crime British Edition. It features 35 disturbing homicide cases guaranteed to keep you up at night. You can pick it up on Amazon as a paperback or Kindle, or download the PDF directly from our site right now. Check the description for the links. You definitely don't want to skip this one. Grab your copy today, and let's get back to the story at hand. To really get what happened, we have to rewind a few years and cross the water to the peaceful streets of Troyes in France's northeast. That's the place where Sophie spent her childhood. Born to humble beginnings, she was raised by her folks, Catherine DeValin and Patrick Lionnet, before they eventually split up. Friends recall a quiet, reserved girl with flowing brunette locks. She wore glasses and always carried a soft, kind demeanor. Animals were her world, particularly horses and house pets. She'd lose track of time watching movies, sketching, or gaming, never once seeking out attention. As a teen, she was the type who would rather stay behind the scenes and lend a hand. She had a natural connection with kids early on, often babysitting for neighbors or watching her little cousins. Looking after little ones brought her a sense of peace. It felt like a role she was born to play. As she aged, instructors characterized her as hush, benevolent, and perhaps a bit too trusting. She steered clear of drama and worked hard to keep the grown-ups satisfied. After her folks split up, she acted as the peacemaker to prevent making things more stressful at the house. The drive to please people and dodge issues eventually wove itself into who she was. Once graduation rolled around and she needed a direction, Sophie gravitated toward looking after kids. She enrolled in a program focused on teaching and caring for little ones. Her goals were uncomplicated. All she sought was a position watching over youngsters, maybe at a daycare center or as a private nanny. Visions of stardom or massive paychecks never crossed her mind. She craved a steady life, a modest apartment to call hers, and a career that suited her sweet nature. However, Just like plenty of youth across the continent, she felt the itch to explore beyond her borders. Mastering English was key to unlocking doors. The British capital, with its diverse vibe and endless chances, looked like the ideal spot to mature. Word of mouth led her to a lady from France who was residing in the UK. This mother required assistance handling her pair of little boys. The role involved staying in their home as a nanny, managing the kids, and tackling light chores. Simultaneously, she planned to polish her language skills. Her potential boss boasted about a career in style and a chic, urban existence, which sounded thrilling and fancy from back home. Following a few conversations, the position was hers. Sophie prepared to relocate to the big city, bunk with the pair, and mind their sons. This seemed like a secure method to transition into adulthood without being isolated in a foreign town. With lodging, food, and a bit of spending cash provided, she informed her mom of her decision to leave. Her mom had concerns, like any parent would, yet she wished for her daughter to build her own memories. At the start of 2016, Sophie loaded up her bags and departed her hometown for the English capital. Initially, everything appeared to be going smoothly. She tended to the kids, mastered the daily schedule, and began getting comfortable in the residence near Wimbledon. Locals often spotted her strolling the lads to class or taking them to the playground. She would offer a bashful grin whenever folks said hello. Staying connected with her family, she texted updates regarding her fresh start, her language progress, and the metropolis. Yet underneath it all, the gig was proving far tougher than it appeared on paper. She worked extensive shifts while earning peanuts, roughly 50 pounds every 7 days. That sum was nowhere near legal standards considering the time she put in. Her host demanded plenty, yet Sophie hardly ever grumbled. Brought up to persevere and adjust, she clung to the hope that the city would eventually offer her a break. However, as time marched on, the atmosphere inside the home began to change. The cozy picture of a trendy, contemporary household began to fracture, trapping Sophie in a reality that ignored standard norms. Her employer went by the name Sabrina Kouider. Hailing from France with North African roots, she had relocated to the UK a few years prior. She billed herself as a creator of clothes and a visual coordinator. Her conversations revolved around famous stars and the glitz of show business. But behind the mask, her existence was chaotic, with sporadic gigs and emerging financial troubles. Her connections with lovers and pals frequently crashed and burned. Those who knew her would eventually characterize her as explosive, theatrical, and domineering. An old flame of hers happened to be Mark Walton. The guy was a music boss from Ireland who helped launch the pop group Boyzone. They had split ages before Sophie arrived, and typically a split like that stays in the rearview mirror. This fixation on him quickly consumed Sabrina's entire life. She pointed fingers at him for betrayal, abuse, and stalking her from the shadows. Year after year, she filed report after report with the cops against him. She took her wild accusations to the internet. In her eyes, he was a dangerous powerhouse, capable of pulling off the impossible. Her new boyfriend, Wissam Madouni, seemed cut from a totally different cloth. Although he shared her French-Algerian background, he was a numbers guy working finance in London. Co-workers knew him as a smart, level-headed, and quiet professional. Moving in with Sabrina meant stepping into an emotional tornado that slowly sucked him in. Eventually, he quit questioning her crazy theories and started buying into them. Her terror regarding Mark Walton transferred directly to him. He adopted her rage as his own. Doctors later called it a shared psychosis, where delusions jump from one person to another. They both convinced themselves Walton was a nemesis out to destroy their family. By the time Sophie arrived at the Southfields' home, the couple was already deep in this twisted reality. Danger seemed to lurk around every corner for them. They were paranoid that spies were watching them and their tech was compromised. Rather than viewing the new nanny as a girl just trying to learn the language, they quickly framed her as a key player in the plot they had cooked up. Initially, the hostility showed up as nitpicking and endless criticism. Sabrina gripped about everything Sophie did, calling her lazy and attacking her character. She humiliated the poor girl whenever other people were around. Terrified of confrontation, Sophie worked harder just to keep the peace. She took on extra chores and stress, repeating her old habit of appeasing angry adults. Suddenly, the nature of the blame shifted gears. Things got weird and sinister when Sabrina insisted Sophie was talking to Mark Walton. She claimed the au pair was a plant sent to drug them and hurt the kids. To Sabrina, Sophie wasn't just a worker anymore. She was a traitor living under their roof, and Wissam didn't shut it down. In fact, he added fuel to the fire. The pair began interrogating her about every text, call, and minor daily event. They demanded to know her whereabouts and questioned her motives for everything. Even the most basic behaviors were twisted into evidence of a cover-up. They lost all grip on reality, even though Sophie looked normal to the outside world. And behind closed doors, however, her world was getting smaller by the day. Sabrina and Wissam started dictating her every move. They confiscated her passport and restricted when she could use her phone. Friends realized she wasn't texting back, and her folks heard from her less and less. On the rare occasions she spoke, she sounded exhausted and beaten down. She mentioned work issues and a desire to return home, yet she never revealed the true extent of the nightmare. Money became another leash. Her paycheck stopped coming in on time, if at all. Broke and without a plane ticket, she felt completely stuck in London, lacking the cash, confidence, or English skills to escape. She had nowhere to turn. Her entire existence relied on the very people who were now destroying her. Months rolled by, and Sophie began to waste away physically. Locals recalled spotting a frail young lady appearing utterly drained and starved. A resident living nearby occasionally slipped her something to eat. Different folks caught the sound of shouting coming through the partitions, often way past midnight. One person sounded controlling and blameful, while the reply was always meek and terrified. During those scarce times, she managed to step outside for a moment. She seemed jittery and closed off, like she was holding on to burdens she had no clue how to unburden. Behind closed doors, the mental torment morphed into a sort of personal inquisition system. Sabrina and Wissam started grilling Sophie for endless stretches, insisting she confessed to being a spy for Mark Walton. The pair insisted that this man was pulling her strings, claiming he employed dark arts and commanded her to taint their food or hurt the kids. They made her take a seat facing a cell phone camera capturing every sound and image, all while they barraged her with endless inquiries and blame. When the jury eventually heard those clips, Sophie came across as shattered and petrified. She attempted to respond using the little bit of English she knew, occasionally parroting their desired answers, just praying the interrogation would end. That pair interpreted those coerced admissions as evidence that their paranoid fantasies were factual. They watched the clips back, dissected them, and returned to her with fresh inquiries. Simultaneously, the mistreatment escalated into bodily harm. An autopsy eventually revealed that Sophie sustained numerous cracked ribs, along with a split breastbone, a shattered jaw, and massive black and blue marks right before she died. These wounds were not the result of just a solitary event. They stemmed from consistent strikes and attacks spanning a period of time. The state claims Sabrina whipped her with items like power cords and that Wissam participated too. Or at the very minimum, he watched the brutality unfold without interfering. Sophie existed in perpetual dread. She looked after the little ones and completed her chores on a daily basis. Yet come sundown, she confronted the risk of fresh drilling, verbal abuse, and physical assaults. She penned texts and scribbles that highlighted her utter hopelessness, stating her desire to quit and return to her country, though she lacked the means to execute it. Within the tiny universe of that residence, those two possessed total authority. She lacked backup, a secure shelter, or an obvious exit strategy. Come the middle of 2017, Sophie was far past being a worker with a tough gig. For all intents and purposes, she was a captive, relying on her very tormentors. When September 2017 arrived, matters hit a fatal climax. Precise specifics of those last moments stayed vague, since only Sabrina and Wissam knew the truth, and they pointed fingers at one another. However, bystanders and scientific data allowed the state to construct a probable timeline. A guest staying at the property one night reported hearing yells, thuds, and running water. Those sounds originated from inside the washroom. The observer caught Sophie crying out, followed by an ultimate weighty quietness. The state alleged that the duo had trapped Sophie within the bathtub, battered her once more, then either submerged her or inflicted mortal wounds she couldn't overcome. One thing is certain, come the next morning, Sophie was deceased. Rather than dialing 911, Sabrina and Wiesem proceeded to the subsequent phase. Hiding their actions, they concealed Sophie's passing for several hours, perhaps even more. Throughout that period, ordinary household items still surrounded them. Their kids were right there inside the home. Dinner still had to get made. Normal life continued right next to the corpse they had to dispose of. On September 20th, 2017, they dragged her out back. They rigged up a crude pyre in the yard. Piling up kindling to feed the blaze, they placed Sophie upon the heap and torched it. To mask the stench, they grilled chicken on a rack right beside it. Heavy fumes wafted across the fences and seeped into homes nearby. That foul odor of charred meat and trash is what finally drove the locals to dial 911. When the fire crew pulled up to the scene, Sophie was incinerated so badly she was barely identifiable. However, their effort to act like everything was fine fell apart. The fire was too big, the reek too intense, and their story too flimsy. Finding human remains in the debris transformed that Wimbledon Park Road home into an investigation zone. Suddenly, the pair who had dominated Sophie's existence found themselves the prime targets of a homicide probe. Once Metropolitan Police detectives assumed command, their first task was naming the deceased. This residence was occupied by a French duo employing a live-in nanny. Nobody had laid eyes on that girl for quite a while. Bones in the yard, along with trinkets sifted from the soot, plus dental records, allowed them to verify the victim was definitely Sophie Lionette. Police grilled Sabrina and Wiesem. Their accounts kept changing. Sabrina actually tried to say Sophie had quit days ago to head back to France, which was obviously a lie. They finally copped to torching the corpse, claiming they freaked out after finding her expired. They swore they didn't kill her. They alleged they found her cold and chose to trash the remains instead of answering questions. Forensic proof painted a totally different picture. The coroner noted fractured ribs and a smashed breastbone, a snapped jaw, and a map of contusions across Sophie's frame. Those wounds happened over weeks, not during a solitary mishap. It revealed a history of systematic torture, not some sudden accident. That's when the cops discovered the tapes. Saved on their mobiles were endless hours of footage from their own inquisitions. The clips showed Sabrina and Wiesem trapping Sophie, repeatedly blaming her for conspiring with Mark Walton. They badgered her to confess that he employed her to drug and molest the household. They spouted insane ideas regarding voodoo and secret plots. Sophie appeared drained, terrified, and totally broken. Those clips later gave the jury and the world a vivid glimpse into the hell she endured inside those walls. Investigators also interviewed locals, pals, and Sophie's kin. People next door recalled hearing screams and watching Sophie waste away. A few mentioned trying to slip her snacks or offer small gestures of pity. Relatives back in France shared texts detailing the verbal abuse, withheld pay, and her desperate wish to return. They knew she was miserable, yet they never guessed the brutality hidden inside that London residence. Then a new player stepped into the spotlight. Mark Walton, in the flesh. Back in Los Angeles, where he was working as a music producer, he got word that he was the main target of their accusations. He didn't hesitate to help the investigation and immediately hopped on a plane to London to take the stand. Once in the courtroom, he opened up about his history with Sabrina and shut down every single crazy lie she told about him. Detectives dug deep but came up empty, finding zero proof he had ever met Sophie or spoken a word to her. To the jurors watching, his steady and rational demeanor completely dismantled the couple's wild story that Sophie was somehow a secret agent in a grand conspiracy. By the time the trial actually started, the state had painted a tragic portrait of a vulnerable girl who was singled out, cut off from the outside world, and made to take the fall for the shattered psyches of two grown adults who were trapped inside a hallucination they built together. The gavel banged to start the trial at the famous Old Bailey Court in London back in 2018, Sabrina Kuiter and Wissam Madouni were staring down serious charges for homicide and obstructing justice. Right when the legal battle kicked off, they confessed that they had torched Sophie's remains and attempted to get rid of the evidence. They copped a plea for the cover-up, but both of them stood firm and claimed they weren't killers. Each one tried to throw the other under the bus, painting themselves as the innocent bystander, less aggressive, and not the one calling the shots. But the prosecution presented a different angle. They argued that Sabrina and Wissam were partners in crime who operated in lockstep for months on end. They outlined a horrifying cycle of cruelty that began with simple verbal jabs, ramped up to forced questioning sessions, and ultimately spiraled into torture and murder. The state made the case that the couple's fixation on Mark Walton had warped their view of the world so severely that they projected all their paranoia and anger onto a girl who had done absolutely nothing wrong. The jury had to sit through the chilling audio tapes of those interrogation sessions. They listened to the relentless grilling, the baseless claims, and Sophie's weak, tired replies. They viewed graphic photos of her trauma and heard specialists break down exactly how and when her bones were shattered. They found out how the pair hijacked her passport, confiscated her cell, and withheld her paychecks. Witnesses from next door took the stand to describe the terrifying screams and the acrid stench of burning flesh. They heard Mark Walton detail the years of stalking he endured from Sabrina and how her fabrications about him just got crazier as time went on. Mental health professionals weighed in on the psychological condition of the accused. Sabrina had a documented past with depression and showed clear symptoms of a personality disorder. The duo exhibited classic signs of a shared psychotic disorder known as folie à deux, where two individuals feed into each other's hallucinations. However, the specialists drew a hard line in the sand. Mental issues didn't give them a free pass. They still knew the difference between good and evil. They calculated how to burn the corpse, and they lied right to the detectives' faces. You know, this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment snap. It was a deliberate campaign carried out over time. When it came down to the million-dollar question of who actually ended Sophie's life in that bathroom, each defendant desperately tried to pin the fatal act on their partner. Sabrina painted herself as a helpless victim under Wissam's thumb. He played the role of a submissive guy who was bullied and bossed around by her. The prosecution countered that nobody needed to pick a side or decide who was worse. Both of them had their hands dirty in the questioning, the assaults, the starving, and the cover-up attempts. Both of them had constructed and reinforced the delusion that Sophie was a spy for Mark Walton. After sitting through weeks of grueling testimony, the jurors headed back to determine the verdict. It was on May 24th, 2018, that a jury convicted both Sabrina Kuiter and Wissam Madouni of murder. During the sentencing hearing in June of 2018, the judge stared down two criminals who had turned a regular house into their own private dungeon. He addressed the brutality of the mistreatment, the extended period it went on, and how the pair had completely stripped Sophie of her dignity and optimism. He described their actions as a display of horrific savagery that lacked any justification. Sabrina Kuiter and Wissam Madouni were handed life sentences with a mandatory minimum of 30 years before parole is even an option. Inside the courtroom, Sophie's parents sat and listened. Her mom, Catherine, and her dad, Patrick, had flown in from France to endure the trial and hear every agonizing detail of what their daughter went through. They recalled a gentle, introverted girl who adored kids, horses, movies, and the simple things in life, assuming she'd one day raise a family of her own. Instead, they were left with the heartbreaking task of planning her funeral. They spoke about the nightmares, the relentless mental images of her pain, and how their world fell apart the moment they learned her body was incinerated in a London backyard. Back over in France, Sophie's funeral was held in a village near her childhood home where family, friends, and strangers gathered to mourn. Across the channel in London, people organized marches and vigils to honor her memory. Other nannies started speaking out publicly regarding their own stories of exploitation and mistreatment. The case highlighted just how easily young live-in workers can vanish from sight, concealed within private residences where practically anything can happen with zero external supervision. Sophie Lynette's story didn't end when the verdict was read. In the years since, numerous documentaries, articles, and podcasts have revisited her tragedy. Reporters and authors have dug into the twisted psychology of the couple who killed her, the intricacies of the legal process, and the broader issue of how society protects or fails to protect those working behind closed doors in other people's homes. The term shared psychosis popped up repeatedly during analyses of the events as experts tried to grasp how two adults could feed each other's delusions. Until they tortured and murdered a young woman who hadn't done a thing to them. For her family, though, none of that analysis brought her back. Sophie remained that shy girl from Troyes who loved children and just wanted a modest life. She had left home to master English, to grow up a bit, and to take a small step toward independence. But instead, she walked right into the orbit of two people locked in their own madness, and they made her the victim of an imaginary war that existed only in their heads. Today, when folks look back on the Sophie Lynette case, they see the horror of what she endured and the fragility of someone far from home with limited language skills, very little money, and a deep desire to trust the people employing her. Her tale stands as a warning about what can go wrong when power goes unchecked behind the doors of a family home. When mental illness blends with control and obsession, and when a kind, quiet person is treated like their life is worthless. In the end, the investigation, the trial, and the life sentences provided some measure of justice. But the heartbreaking core of this story remained exactly the same. A 21-year-old French au pair stranded in a strange city whose only real crime was trusting the wrong people. She aimed for a brighter tomorrow, yet she gambled on some truly shady characters. It was a cool night in September 2017, tucked away in a sleepy part of southwest London.